For 6 days in May 1980, this building in central gunmen hold 26 people hostage. On the afternoon of day 6 of the siege, the gunmen kill one hostage and threw his body out. At 7:23 that evening, strange figures appear on the roof. The world is about to witness one of its most secretive organizations in action, the Special Air Service, the SAS.
The Special Air Service Regiment, the SAS, guards its secrets carefully. I'm Tim Collins, and I served 23 years in the British Army, including both Gulf Wars. Those that know the regiment, who know the need for secrecy, believe there's only one story that should ever be told.
It's the story of how and where the SAS began. It's the story of how the regiment was founded. The story of one man, David Sterling, and the band of misfits and rule breakers who were with him on day one, the originals. And it's not the story you'd expect. Conventional wisdom has it that Sterling died without putting on record how he created the SAS. The same is said about the originals.
Well, it had to be regarded as a new type of force to extract the very maximum out of surprise and guile.
And then Kit Paddy had got, I think it was 48 planes, and so later we said.
And 8 days later, we went back and got another 24 off of the field, with no bother at all.
We thought of the others that we didn't know where they were, whether they were alive or dead. I think the most of us wanted to continue. We'd gone through so much, so whatever happened afterwards was going to be, as you would say, a piece of cake. It wasn't, of course, but...
...1984. A group of old soldiers gather to remember. They are modest and unassuming. They have never told their stories in full. And these are known only to a few. Because in the early years of World War II, they were part of something remarkable. Because they are the founders of the Special Air Service.
The SAS was 1941 by a young Scots Guards officer, David Sterling. Most military historians believe that Sterling and the people with him on day one, the originals, died without ever putting their on record. They're wrong.
Film roll 42, 53, take 1.
At that dinner over 20 years ago, Sterling and those originals fit enough to travel told their story for the first time. Ever since, those
Cheers to the Colonel.
Colonel David.
Yep. Hooray! Hip hip. Hooray! Hip hip. Hooray!
From the start, we knew we would never make it a regiment. And this, not only did we operate it effectively, but we succeeded in establishing a new role. And that band of vagabonds had to grasp what they had to do in order to get there.
There is almost no visual record of what the originals did. We have recreated their stories based on the precise given by the originals themselves, and the man they always call Colonel David, no matter rank, captain or major, at various parts of their story.
To create an organisation like the SAS takes a very special sort of man. One was certainly not of the normal mould.
David Sterling was born into the Scottish aristocracy in 1915. This statue, above the family home close to Dunblane, was raised by members of the SAS. When he's still a small, mother asks him what he'll do in life that people will remember him by. The early signs aren't good. He's sent on from Cambridge for drinking and gambling. The Alps, then the American Rockies. His aim, to be the first man to climb Everest. (1939). War breaks out with Germany. Stirling joins the Scots Guards. But the Guards' base at Pirbright is close to the gaming tables of the London clubs. In one lecture, Stirling falls asleep. The lecturer asks him to repeat what he's just. Stirling does. The incident will come back to haunt Stirling at a critical moment in the story of the SAS. Stirling volunteers for the Guards Commando. In 1941, he goes to the force led by Robert Laycock. Hitler occupies Europe. Control of the Mediterranean is vital. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps has driven the British back to the Egyptian border.
British commando operations are cancelled. It's frustrating, but it's also the beginning of an amazing story. The story of David Stirling and the Special Air Service.
They didn't want to risk having casualties. And therefore, unless the weather was absolutely right or all the other requirements for any operational undertaking, it reduced the hazards of that operation to a minimum. They wouldn't have, so we were involved in a series of postponement and of cancellations.
But the commando experience with Lay Force is already sowing an idea in Stirling's head.
It got thinking regarding how one could carry out the row at 1/100th of the cost. And having realized that that was what was required, it made it all the easier. In fact, it made it inevitable to come up with a proposition along the lines of SAS.
Except there's a catch. The boredom of being pulled back from operations has another consequence, one that doesn't appear in any official history. The man who founds the SAS faces a court-martial for cowardice.
I would go out at 8 o'clock in the evening, having recovered from the appalling hangover from my activities in Nauru, and re-established my illness by the activities that following night. And they rumbled this in the end.
Returning from a commando night exercise, Stirling trips, rips an eye, and is taken to hospital. The enemies he's already making at Middle East headquarters descend.
It was a deliberate effort to injure myself so I wouldn't have to go on the active operations. They won't justify prosecution as a kind. And they had a committee checking it.
Stirling has the idea for what will become the... But Lay Force is disbanded, and he potentially faces a court-martial. It's time for the story twist.
Stirling, another Guards officer, Jock Lewis, organised an unofficial parachute drop with a shipment of parachutes which should have gone to India. Like Stirling, Lewis isn't a career soldier. He's a former president of the Oxford University Rowing Club. Like Stirling, he's also thinking about small-scale raiding groups. Exercise goes wrong. Stirling's chute catches in the tailplane and is ripped open. He's almost killed.
It kept, fortunately, the canopy above it. But obviously let a lot more air through, so I descended a good deal than my companions.
In fact, Stirling's lucky to survive. He hits the ground hard and he's blinded. And whilst he recovers his sight fairly quickly, his legs are paralysed. It looks like the end for Stirling the soldier and for his idea of an SAS.
The Dead Africa, 1941. A young Guards officer, David Stirling, prepares to make an unofficial parachute jump. He already has the germ of an idea for a revolutionary new unit, which will become the SAS. But the jump goes wrong, and his legs are paralysed. Stirling is in hospital. It should be the end. In fact, it's the beginning.
Because he gave me a marvellous opportunity to, while my legs regained their power, to do some homework on the project with very little interference, and to write a paper on the proposals.
These, what Stirling calls hard principles, are in fact military revolution. Others will refine them, but they're the very essence of modern special forces. What today we call unconventional, the very heart of the SAS.
Well, it had to be regarded as a new type of force to extract the very maximum out of surprise and guile. We never put a unit in acquiring defense while it undertook its mission. We have obviously access to intelligence, because without that we wouldn't be able to determine the correct priority and targets. As we were going to develop methods and techniques which were new in army terms, therefore we'd have to have a special status of our own.
Stirling's targets will also be different. His new units will be strategic, deep behind the lines, at ports.
Core of Stirling's idea is essentially a numbers game. Where the commandos send 600 men, Stirling's revolution is to do it with just 4.
One entire commando of 600 men or so probably couldn't then tackling more than perhaps 2 landing grounds on the same night. Then more than 3/4 of the force would be taken up with defending those who were actually operating. We preferred for every subunit of 4 or 5 men tackle a full target area their own. And if they failed, it was more than compensated by the fact that with 60 men we could attack up to 20 targets on the same night.
There are also psychological reasons for having units of just 4 men.
When we decided that the 4-man module number, it was psychologically easier to make them all interdependent. So we had 4 pairs of ears which were listening and 4 pairs of...
Their targets will be along the coastal strip of North Africa where the war is fought, between the sea and the desert. Tobruk, Gazala, Benghazi, hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. German paratroopers have just seized the island of Crete. British generals want their own parachute unit. The politically astute Stirling gives them what they want. His new force will parachute in. And he links his proposal to an actual Allied. On the next Allied offensive, his men will parachute behind the lines, take out the superiority. Stirling even has a name for his revolutionary new unit.
Came mainly from the fact that I was anxious to get the full cooperation of a very individual called Dudley.
Clark is one of the masters of World War II deception. He's dropping dummy parachutes, which can be seen by Italian prisoners, so they'll get word back that the Allies have a parachute force. The name of the non-existent force, the Special Air Service.
He promised to give me all the help he could. He's quite an influential chap. If I would use the name of his Burgers Brigade of parachutists, which is the SAS. So I settled for L Detachment.
L stands for learner. Stirling's having a joke. So he has an idea, written in his hospital bed on a sheet of paper and pencil. He's got a name in the service. He's even got in mind a first operation, but he's got a problem. He has to sell the idea to the staff officers at headquarters Middle East, the very people who recently tried to court-martial him.
There was no way that anybody was going to back the scheme, except possibly at the very top. Remember the situation that the short gap between the First and Second World War, the great active soldiers who had survived were in active command, but there was an enormous residue of staff officers in the First World War who set the spirit of the administration and wholly obstructive to anything that would look like a new idea. There was no way you could put it in except to the Commander-in-Chief. Never at the Middle East headquarters. They were layer upon layer like shit. We had to more or less ignore the normal rules and regulations. So I decided to go and see General Ritchie.
General Ritchie is Deputy Chief of British Forces in the Middle East. Sterling's plan is to present his paper to Ritchie's aide-de-camp, a Scots Guards officer like himself.
Which is radical enough in its own right. But Sterling doesn't have a pass, and the guards won't let him in. What he's about to do is unbelievable.
So I had to use my crutchy ladder to get over the wire when the guards weren't looking, which of course unfortunately they did just after I got to the ground on the other side. And I wasn't able to run very fast because of my lacking the crutches.
The guards chase Sterling inside. By sheer chance, Sterling finds himself in the corridor with a man he's looking for his office. Sterling knocks and goes in, but
I'd forgotten he was the same chap who'd, when I was in the supplementary reserve of the Scots Guard, he tried very hard to have me sacked. I didn't take my military training very seriously, and he thought outrageously, inadequately so.
by incredible coincidence, it's the same officer in whose lecture Sterling had fallen asleep in the guards' depot at Pirbright.
So I appeared and put a paper for him to read. He was absolutely outraged.
The aide calls the guards. Sterling heads back into the corridor and turns into the next office,
which is General Ritchie, which is another rare bit of good fortune, and asked him to read this paper. He was very courteous and took him rather by surprise, and he settled down to read it. And about halfway through, he really got quite engrossed in it and forgotten the rather irregular way it had been presented. When he finished the paper, he said, "This is something we can use. This paper looks real promise." And that was the beginning of the SAS.
What Sterling has just done is amazing. If he'd been caught, he'd have been thrown in jail. And he's promoted and authorised to raise a force of 65 officers and men.
One of the first people he recruits is Jock Lewis, who organised the first parachute jump. Another is Irish and British line rugby international Blair Paddy Main. But with Main's a problem.
He's in prison, awaiting a court-martial.
He found Reed out, his commanding officer, and was a time in the jail at Geneva. I went to interview him, and he had every reason not to take me very seriously as a soldier. I told him that the proposition was a good one, and he joined up. But I told him that very firmly this command wasn't for hitting. And he always subsequently honoured that commitment.
For the men, Sterling turns to those he knows. The men who... all the misfits, rule breakers and mavericks, all looking for action. Jim Almonds, former policeman, caught poaching and training.
I consider it personal training. It's a very daring and out of the way thing to be. And the cookhouse is rather short of fresh meat anyway, so I not only trained myself, I provided something for the cookhouse.
Pat Riley, an Irish-American. He has to smudge the writing on his papers to join the British Army. Johnny Cooper, too young to join up, he got in by bribing a recruiting sergeant.
I had a lot of problems getting into the army because they thought that I wasn't big enough, and they turned me down. And then I was tipped off by a friend of mine who was living in the same accommodation in Bradford when I was learning apprenticeship, and said, look, you go down and try and join the Guards, but do take 2 half-crowns with you.
Do we go in, carry on?
Reg Seekings fiddled his name onto a special duties list for commando training without his commanding officer knowing. Bob Bennett got into trouble in the Guards for always volunteering for hazardous assignments.
A friend of mine, Lofty Baker, and myself volunteered for everything that came up on detail, things like machine gunner, on a trawler, rear gunner. And we eventually were taken in front of an officer who said if we volunteered for anything else, we'd be punished.
Dave Kershaw fought against Franco, hardened socialist who got on well with the aristocratic Sterling.
I remember he said to me, what will your wife say if she that you've joined this parachute unit? I said, she won't know, she won't know anything at all about it.
Dave Kershaw wasn't at the dinner. Dave was seriously ill. He'd done his and been driven home. He died the next morning. The originals said he'd only held on to life to put his story forward. Also present at the dinner are 2 others who are not there on day 1, but who are assigned honorary original status. Mike Sadler, desert navigator, who'll play a key role in one of the original's most spectacular desert operations. And the very Reverend Fraser McCluskey, he'll parachute into occupation with the originals. These are the men today's SAS call the originals, but they also have another name for them after the Hollywood film, Dozen.
Here's to the Colonel.
Colonel David.
Colonel David.
So, Sterling has his unit, and he has his men, but now the bureaucrats who oppose him in headquarters Middle East descend. It's time for the very first operation, but it's not one you'll see in any official history book.
North Africa, 1941. David Sterling, a young Scots Guards lieutenant, has a revolutionary idea of war.
Sterling's idea, the SAS, the generals approve, but now his enemies at Middle East headquarters try to stop him. What happens next breaks all the rules, isn't in any official history the first ever operation for the SAS.
We simply weren't able to get what we'd been assigned, and we were told it would take several weeks, which we couldn't afford. We had to get down to training immediately.
We were taken to a spot on the Suez Canal, a place called Cabrit, which was just an expanse of sand going down to the Suez Canal.
When I arrived there was a little board stood in the ground. It just said L detachment. There was a vast space behind it.
And someone said, well, where's the camp? And Colonel David said, well, that's the first job, is to steal one. And down the bottom of the road, about 2 miles down the road, was a great big New Zealand camp, and they were up in the desert operating. And that evening we were taken down to Kiwi camp, where we stole tents, tents for the officers' mess, tent for the sergeant's mess. We stole a piano, stole everything, the whole camp.
By next morning, we had probably the best camp in the area. I've forgotten what we did to the piano. I think we gave it back to them as part of a bribe to hold them, which they didn't, and they laughed quite a lot at the end because they couldn't help but identify where they had all gone.
The infant SAS train themselves. Parachuting, explosives, desert navigation and survival. At the heart of this, is Jock Lewis.
He was probably the greatest training officer, without question, I think, in the Middle East area. He improvised all kinds of new techniques, which became the foundation, really, of today's SAS.
He never did a thing that he wouldn't do himself, never asked us to do a thing that he wouldn't do himself. And he set the example all the time, so what could you do? He jumps off a truck at 40 miles an hour, and he asks you to jump off at 30. We just did it. You can't argue against people like that.
But the first real parachute drop will end in tragedy.
So the first plane took off, loaded up. I myself was on the second lift, standing with Dave Kershaw and the rest of the chaps. Dave Kershaw said, "I'm sure something came out from the plane," and I said, "Well, if it had done, I'd shoot." And Jock Lewis explained that Warburton, a chap named Warburton and another chap named Duffy had been killed, and what had happened, the ring had jumped over the hooks, hadn't developed. And Jock Lewis, being the man he was, said that hooks would be made safe and we'd all be jumping in the morning. And we all went back to our tents with a 50 tin of cigarettes and smoked till the next morning. And the next morning convinced me that I was with the right, because they were offered at that parade to leave the unit if they wanted to, and not one left. And from then on, the jumping went perfectly okay.
But there's a problem. The original's primary mission is to destroy enemy aircraft. And to do this effectively, they need a bomb which will both explode and ignite at the same time, and it must be small enough for them to carry 10 to 20 each. The engineers can't help.
They create an explosion, but no ignition. Or ignition with not enough bang.
3, 2, 1,
Engineers say there's no way of combining the two.
So Jock Lewis invents his own, the Lewis bomb. Plastic explosive, engine oil, thermite and steel filings.
The great day arrived, and Jock had mixed up a mixture of plastic, thermite and steel filings. That was the secret, steel filings.
3, 2, 1.
And of course the thing blew up. And it was a great moment, a great moment.
To any regiment, its badge is sacrosanct. Stirling knows this. He runs a competition for the unit's own badge and motto. The badge winner is what is now famous as the Winged Excalibur. The front runner for the motto is Descend to Defend. Stirling changes it to Who Dares Wins. But, again, there's a problem. It's all unofficial. Stirling resorts to a military custom. If a general salutes the badge, he authorises it.
Trapping General Orkinek when he came down to do it.
Incredibly, that inspection was captured in a few feet of film. This is it. It has lain in the archives for over 60 years.
I was standing at one side to him, the demonstration that we laid on for him. And then as he was coming up to the salute, I turned to him and he'd saluted, so that was it.
November 1941. It's time for the Allied commanders are about to launch Operation Crusader. Objective, push back the enemy lines and relieve Tobruk. But the enemy's air superiority is a danger. Stirling addressed in his paper to the generals. The SAS will parachute behind the lines and eliminate enemy aircraft at the key airfields at Gazala and Tamimi. Then they'll exfiltrate across the Great Sand Sea to a rendezvous with the Long-Range Desert Group, the LRDG. The LRDG is gathering and fighting unit, specialising in desert navigation, operating deep behind the lines. Many people believe the SAS from the LRDG. It wasn't. But they'll play a key role in the first months of the SAS. This is the actual top-secret order from the 8th Army HQ to David Stirling, authorising the first ever SAS. The mission of death and disaster, an absolute determination not to accept defeat, an amazing decision to break all the rules, and a final triumph. And because of this, there will be an SAS.
We knew it was very important that that Colonel Stirling had to have a success, having had such a job to raise a unit, because most people in the Middle East were so anti and thought that Colonel Stirling was mad, you know, talking about getting behind lines and doing these sort of things.
The originals prepare their weapons and explosives, tied to their departure point at Bagouche. Then, massive stop. Middle East HQ gives Stirling the opportunity to cancel the operation. Stirling and the originals face a terrible dilemma. Cancel, and the enemy within will kill off the SAS before it's even begun. But jump into storm, and most of them won't survive.
We made an undertaking. We would never again be subject to the frustrations of the commander days. Therefore, I wasn't simply prepared to see the first of our operations being postponed, or it couldn't be postponed at all, because it had to take place on a certain evening.
Well, we all went into a tent and we were told that the operation could be put back, but then it would not be tactically sound to do so, but the weather was against us going. We were all given the option of opting out.
We was trying to get away from this cancellation all the time. There's nothing worse than to build yourself up for an operation that is cancelled. We wanted to get in.
Command was rather anxious to see if we did postpone it. However, we refused absolutely. They gave us the option. So we went ahead.
That evening we were given a meal. It was out of this world. The RAF had laid it on. And it was like the Last Supper, because what went through my mind, what a beautiful meal this is, you know, and what's it in aid of? I think the RAF thought they'd never see any of us again, you know.
Then the originals climb into their and take off.
Rightly, the people will turn around most probably and prostrate and say, we should never have dropped under those conditions. But if we hadn't, there would never have been an SAS, that is for sure.
November 1941, the first official SAS mission. Parachute behind the lines prior to an Allied offensive, take air cover, which threatens that offensive. But as they take off, a massive storm blows up. Middle East HQ.
Stirling and the originals face a terrible dilemma. Call off the operation and the enemies within will destroy the SAS before it's even begun, or jump into a storm against the likelihood that most of them won't survive. They jump.
The sand blew over the coastline. It made it impossible for the aircraft carrying us to know where the coastline point from which they were going to be able to determine their dropping zone for the parachutists related to the target area.
And our aircraft got into the searchlights over the Gulf of Bumba, and all this flak was coming up. It was breeder fire, 15, 20 millimetre, all different colours. And the plane inside was absolutely lit up.
There's these flaming onions were coming up one after another at us very slowly. They looked very slowly as they came, but as they passed the door, which is wide open, they went like hell, actually. They really...
And just walked up and down as though nothing cared at all. He gets, well, he's not frightened, why am I frightened? He said, not to worry, but we'll have to jump. We don't know where we are, but we're going to jump, and I've told the pilot.
The pilot said that it was very, very dodgy, and should he call it off? And Colonel David said no, certainly not.
It was a night without any moon. It was pitch black. And they dropped the 65 men taking part all over the bloody shop. When we hit the ground, there were quite a few of us were knocked out.
You just couldn't get out of the parachute. You were being dragged along with your arms up, dragged the desert.
Dragged in the sand, and it was just folding the skin back, getting underneath, and it was a shocking state.
I went streaming off, and luckily for me, because some of them were dragged to death, my parachute got caught, and I was trying to knock my quick release, and I was in such a state of shock, I hadn't turned the bloody.
The canisters containing the Lewis bombs are lost in the storm. There's no way they can continue. Some of the men are badly injured. The originals leave them water, then turn for the almost impossible trek across the desert to the rendezvous point.
We had 2 casualties, but we left water with these 2 chaps and had to leave them there, and we don't know from this day, from that day to this, whether they survived or not. I don't think they did. But it was an awful feeling to leave 2 friends as you've been, operating with and training with.
At the rendezvous, the men of the long-range desert group wait. Then, at last, the first figures appear on the horizon. There aren't many. David Stirling makes it. Jock Lewis makes it. 60 parachute into a storm. 21, just 21, survived to make it to the rendezvous. It's exactly the sort of failure that Stirling's enemies at Middle East headquarters would want.
They were very chuffed that the unit had apparently been annihilated, and they were going to disband us, as it was.
Oh, we were thinking that 21 of us came out of that. We thought of the others that we didn't know whether they were alive or dead. I think wanted to continue. We'd gone through so much, so whatever happened afterwards was going to be, a piece of cake. It wasn't, of course, but...
Stirling and the originals appear to have lost their first battle against the opposition at Middle East headquarters. But then this is David Stirling, and these are the...
Decides if the long-range desert group can bring them out, the long-range desert group can take them in.
In meeting LRDG, they picked this up, and everybody's, well, crikey, if these people can penetrate this far, why the hell take all and trouble and jeopardize the operation by drop by paratroop, and why not get them to carry us in? And of course, everybody had this view, right from the lowest private, as you could say. I mean, it's so obvious. We had no idea that we had trolls penetrating 200 or 300, 400 miles behind the enemy position. And it made it stupid, the idea of paratrooping in.
Stirling orders the 21 to return to their camp secret. He orders them to beg, steal more gear. Then, totally unofficially, carried by the long-range desert group, they go back into the desert and resume their mission to attack enemy aircraft and airfields.
No after-action reports exist of what happened next. The only account is by the originals themselves, and this is the first time they've told what happened.
Bill Fraser's party got the biggest bag, 87 planes on an airfield.
And then it came through that Paddy had got, I think it was 48, I don't know whether it was 48 or 42 planes on the ground, you know, so obviously there was jubilation. We're back in business, sort of thing.
I rejoined Paddy and we went back to the same place as they'd been to and got another 24 off of the airfield with no bother at all, except that we were only using 20-minute time pencils, and these weren't efficient enough because we were still on the airfield when they started going up. So we started running and we suddenly heard Italians challenging, saying Avanti, and Paddy in his German said Freund, which they didn't, started shooting. So we just ran through throwing grenades and firing and managed to get through and back to the RV.
The originals have gone back and completed their mission without cost. Gentleman Jim Almonds is with Jock Lewis, returning from an attack when they're spotted by German fighter planes.
I took a Bren gun and Bob Lilly took a box of magazines and we bailed off because knoll there, and good enough protection, that knoll, so he couldn't actually hit us.
Stukas join the attack. The originals spread out, curl as tight as they can. The attackers shell and strafe anything that looks like an SAS man.
Jock Lewis stayed too long in the truck and he got caught in that fire. He got hit and it severed the artery and it mashed everything up, so it was such a mess where the bullet came out. There was no sort of way of trying to do anything with it. I'd followed old Jock anywhere. He was a good fellow.
Only when their mission is accomplished does David the originals out of the desert and report back to Middle East headquarters.
They didn't know who the hell had destroyed it. And then when they got a dispatch from the 8th Army, that they realized that the L Detachment would be coming back for recruiting and the considerable expansion of establishment. And hit them rather hard, but it made us very happy.
David Stirling is promoted to Major and authorised to raise more men. He and the originals have come through their baptism of fire. They've dared and they've won, but it's only the beginning.
He's taken a revolutionary concept from a scrappy piece of paper to a fighting unit. He's forged the birth of this. Full faces to formidable opponents, the enemy behind the lines and the bureaucrats at Middle East headquarters. Now it's time to up the stakes. Now it's time for and the original to change the rules, to change the game,